Hi everyone, I'm Marn. I'm a librarian over at the Arthur Miller branch, the one in the community center. Perhaps you've seen me around there. Today I'm going to be doing a sewing tutorial to teach some basic hand sewing techniques for those of you who would perhaps like to sew a face mask for yourself but don't have a sewing machine at home, or for anyone who's interested in learning the skill of hand sewing. Um, as with any new skill, just a little bit of practice is all it takes. Since there are so many different types of face mask patterns out there and plenty of great tutorials, I recommend you find one of those that will work for you, will work for the supplies you might have in your house, and then just apply these basic hand stitching techniques where it tells you to sew by machine in those tutorials. I have been practicing hand sewing a face mask pattern that was put out by Providence St. John's Hospital, just to make sure it could be done. And it was a fairly simple one, and it didn't require any elastic because I do not have any elastic in my house. So if you'd like to try that one, the link for the pattern and the tutorial should be included in this post. Okay, to start practicing, you'll need some scrap fabric you might have lying around the house, thread, a sewing needle, that's the one with the eye at the end, sewing pins. Safety pins can work if you don't have any sewing pins in the house. You'll also need a ruler, a pair of scissors, and then a fabric pen, which would be washable, or a regular pen, as I have here in this case, can work in a pinch, as it will not show on the other side of your fabric. The first step to take before doing any sewing is to take your two pieces of scrap fabric, whatever you have lying around the house. I recommend a woven cotton. Knits are a little bit tricky to learn with. This is a scrap I've cut off of a skirt. That could work. I will be working with this lighter colored fabric so you can see what I'm doing. This one's a larger chunk that you can fold in half. And then you just need to pin it. You want to line up your edges. That's how you'll make your seam. And then just put a couple pins in. Pins are just to keep your fabric from moving around while you are sewing. And then everyone's favorite part, threading the needle. Take a chunk of thread or an okay length. For practice, it doesn't need to be too terribly long and it'll keep you from knotting it up. Cut that off. I'm using black thread just so that you can see what I'm doing on my lighter fabric here. And then take your sewing needle, the one with the eye at the end, and you just thread the thread through that needle, or that eye rather. If you have a needle threader, it's a tiny little device, great, use it, but most of us don't. If it's really frayed, trim your edge and try again. I sew single thread, that's how quilters do it, because you can remove the needle, pick out any stitches, and then rethread your needle and just keep going. But if you don't feel confident that you'll be able to hang on to this short little tail up here, feel free to sew double thread. It is a little bit sturdier, so that's good. However, if you make any mistakes, you just have to cut your thread, remove the needle, tie it off, and then start over again with a new piece of thread. So tying knots, once you've got your needle on there, tie a knot at the end. For double thread, you just tie a knot. If you're sewing single thread, you leave your tail up here. A single knot will frequently come through, so I'll double knot. So I just roll it around my finger, pull it through the loop, and I go a second time to do a double knot. And there you go, knot on your thread. What I forgot to have you do first is mark your sewing line if you think you will need that. So we'll just mark a 1/4 inch in from the edge. That will create your seam allowance. And so you just line up your ruler, 1/4 inch, draw a line. I am using a pen because I forgot to grab my fabric marker. And so I'll just mark a little line here. it will show, it won't wash out, but since I'll flip it over, no one will ever see this, so it's not super necessary that it's fabric washable, and like I said. And then mark another spot or two, a 1/4 inch in from the edge, and if you think you'll need it, draw a line between all those little dashes with your pen or marker, and then you have a nice sewing line right here. So then we'll just sew right on top of that line. So the very first basic of basic stitches is the running stitch. Because I'm trying to work with this black thread on the lighter fabric to show you guys, I'm actually not going to stitch on my black line I just drew so that you can see a little easier. So I'm going to be sewing a little bit below it, but feel free to sew right on the line you've marked. Or if you can eyeball it, great. You stick your thread in a little bit from the edge. This will fray over here, so you want to give yourself just a little bit of distance. Pull it through. Oh, my knot didn't stick. Let me try doubling it up again. If you've got a little bit more of an open weave, you need a pretty big knot. So stick it in, pull it through, got it pretty tight. Then I will come back up through, essentially taking a stitch like so, and then double back to that knot and coming back where I came out originally, just as a little bit of an extra reinforcement. It's not usually necessarily needed, but to do the running stitch, you just go a little ways farther down, stick your needle in, pop it back up through. You go through both layers. The lighting's not great here. Both layers, come back up through, pull it tight, so, and then just keep doing that. If you take little teenier little steps, it'll be a little bit of a tighter stitch, maybe a little sturdier. You can even stick your needle through, bring it up, stick it back through, bring it up, load a couple stitches onto your needle essentially, and then pull it through. It saves some time. It can be a little trickier. As you can see, I made that caused like a really big stitch for me instead of a smaller stitch. So you stitch. So this is the running stitch. As you stitch, and then there's a gap as it's on the back side, and then there's a stitch and a gap and a stitch. That is your running stitch. Once you've gotten to the end of where you want your seam to be, or you're practicing and you're like, wow, this is really easy, I just want to move on, and you want to knot it. So I will, again, for extra stability, sometimes stitch back and come back up where that thread was, make this loop, stick my needle through the loop. Oh, I'm catching all the pins. And yank it kind of tight, and then I will tie a knot as close as possible to the fabric. If you're doing double thread, you can tie it like this. I will use my needle to kind of tighten that knot as close to the fabric as possible, just as close as you possibly can get it. If you're doing double thread, you have both ends coming through at the same time, you would cut your thread, then you'd have two ends sticking up, and then you can just tie a knot and double knot it, like you were double knotting your shoelaces. Either one would work, but for single thread, you tie a knot as close as possible, and then you want to cut close to
to your knot, not so close to your fabric you cut the knot off or let it fray, but you don't want to have a ton of thread hanging off. If you have like a long tail at the beginning, you want to clip your threads there. Just makes for a neater appearance. And then pull these out. So when you would turn your fabric right side out, you've got two chunk pieces of fabric sewn to each other. And that is the running stitch. For the back stitch, I need to retie a knot. Just go through it twice so I have a double knot. Pull tight. Pretend we're starting at the beginning. We're just going to pick up right here. Again, you just set your knot, pull a stitch through, and you're knotted. You go back. If you want a little extra sturdiness, go through that loop, pull it tight. Not sure if you can see what's going on because my tail is kind of long. What I did there before I pulled it through the new loop was essentially a back stitch. Let's see if I can bring it closer. So the back stitch, you take a stitch, pull it through, and then you come back to the end of that last stitch. Put your needle in and then come out a little bit. I don't know if I've been off camera. You go back, you come through a little bit farther ahead. So you're taking your thread back, you're back stitching. So here we are. We come to stick our needle in where that last stitch was. Going back and then come out a little bit farther forward. Get rid of that pin so you can see what I'm doing. Then pull it through. And you just keep doing this. This takes a little bit more time, takes a lot more thread, but it makes for a much sturdier, tighter stitch. It can be, if you're getting nice and tight short little stitches, it can be just as sturdy as what the sewing machine can produce. And it can look, if you're able to go in a straight line, it can look pretty nice too on the one side. It will look a little messier on the back side. This actually is pretty good for me. I sometimes can make a real mess on the back. But if this is a seam that's on the inside of your garment, project, whatever, no one will see it. So same sort of thing, when you come to the end, or you're running out of thread and you gotta pick up and start again, you wanna do your back stitch, and then you come back to the same place. Instead of going a little bit farther ahead, I make that loop, I run my thread through that loop, and then I tie a knot as close as possible to the fabric. I don't know if you can see. So yeah, it's kind of sticking a little bit up off the fabric, so I just stick the needle in there to hold it close to the fabric while I tighten it. My fingers keep getting in the way, I'm not sure I can show it. And then my knot is kind of close. And then I snip my ends. And then I've got back stitch. So then once your seam is finished and you turn your fabric flip it over to your right side out, or in this case, turn it inside out or right side out like a pillowcase, you've then got a seam. Where it was back stitching, see, it's pretty tight, it's pretty sturdy. And that is what you need for any basic project, or back stitch is definitely recommended if you want to try making a face mask but don't have a sewing machine.